Welcome to episode 3 of the Philosophical Rambler podcast. Today we are going to be talking about part 2 of the series that we are doing on the history of existentialism. T.J. Johnson and I will be speaking about the latter philosophers dealing with existentialism, or the more modern existentialist philosophers. If you'd like to expand on that, T.J.?
Well, basically, in the first one, we spoke about the early existentialists. So, people like Freud and Jung. But now we're going to talk about the later existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and many more. And I think it's important because in part 1, we said that the most of the early philosophers drove from experience, but the later ones drove from opinion. So there's definitely a difference between the two, and they shouldn't be put in the same basket.
I completely agree. And obviously, TJ, you have much more experience with these particular philosophers than I do. So you want to start off with perhaps Camus?
Well, Camus was born in 1913, died in 1960. And when reading a lot of the existentialists saying that we should look for meaning, we look for meaning in our life, he proposed that the world around us is meaningless. There's nothing to it. Our lives have no meaning. When we die, we die. And so he proposed absurdism. So basically, we are humans that we're creatures that seek out meaning in a world where there isn't any. And imagine for a second that a being of a higher species comes to you and says, your life has no meaning. You can take it from me. I've been to the ends of time and the beginning of time. So your life has no meaning. Camus said that you could either do one of three things. Suicide, which he says you shouldn't do, obviously. That's basically giving in to the urge of, I can't deal with this, I'm just going to end it. But since there's no meaning, you've not really resolved anything, you're just carrying on the problem. Then there was philosophical suicide, which is you now know that your life has no meaning, but you reject the hurtful facts for comforting lies and follow a higher power. Let's say a religion or a cult, or maybe you look to a different philosophy for a bit of comfort. And then there is embracing the absurd, saying, I'm standing on the edge of the comfort in the small things you do, like walking down the street or going to the beach, and, just enjoying life, knowing that it doesn't have any meaning, has no consequences, and so I'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I think Camus is arguably probably the most influential existentialist philosopher in contemporary times. I think you would agree with that.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the reasons that he is so influential, besides people frequently quoting him on, say, Instagram or TikTok or blog articles or such, is he really, I would say, baptized the philosophy of existentialism, and then obviously made it into his own thing, which was nihilism. I mean, not nihilism, but rather absurdism. And I think absurdism is the baptized version of existentialism into the 60s, or the counterculture of the 60s. You see a lot of tendencies from Camus to speak from the perspective of the French philosophers of the 1960s.
Well, he was very good friends with Jean-Paul Sartre, and
Yes.
that's where most of his ideas came from, was talking with Sartre and his wife, Simone de Beauvoir, and just talking about them. And in the end, he realised that they had two conflicting ideas, and so he basically wrote a letter famously saying, our friendship has not been an easy one, and breaking it off.
So if you could explain to the listeners, what was the difference between Camus and Sartre?
So Sartre was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Well, to put it into perspective, let's start with Camus. Camus was born in 1913, Algeria, and of course, he was surrounded by conflict from the moment he was born. There was protests every day because it's an Arab country that the French invaded. So it's a mixture of the French and Arabian people. Then there's his father dying in the Great War in 1914, so Camus was 1 year old. His mother was illiterate and going blind and deaf, and they lived in absolute squalor. So he only really got into school when he got a scholarship. And then he carried on and carried on. And meanwhile, Jean-Paul Sartre was born in France with a silver spoon in his mouth, parents that basically loved him and adored the world that he stepped on. And so Camus, by the end, was saying, no, I can talk about conflict because I've been in the eye of the storm. I was born in it, and I've had to, there's a famous political speech that he had to give, and there's another photo of the entrance to the to the building he was giving the speech in. And on one side were the French, and the police were kind of holding them back from the Algerian people. And so, he was saying, Sartre, you can't know. If you're talking about conflict, you don't know conflict.
Yeah, Sartre was, and to put it in your words from the previous episode, more of the armchair philosopher rather than
very
the
much
experiential philosopher, which is something that I find interesting, not to go off subject, but about my favorite philosopher, Rousseau. Rousseau was much more of an armchair philosopher, yet he had brilliant insights. So it doesn't mean that just because someone's an armchair philosopher that they don't necessarily have
and pain is subjective and relative.
Yes, for sure.
The world is the one you are built around in. If you were born in India, you'd most likely be a Sikh, and you would, most likely work a standard 9 to 5 job for pittance. But in America, you would probably be most likely born into a middle class family in the suburbs and be able to get about reasonably well. So the world is the one we're born in, and it just so happened that Camus' pain was, of course, greater, but to someone like Sartre, who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he considers, his car not being ready on time, he considers that to be an equal pain to, losing his father at the age of 1. And that, of course, infuriated Camus, because these things obviously aren't the same, but Sartre was saying they are.
It seems to me to be what you were talking about, which is the relative pain. Because people who have not experienced immense physical or psychological pain believe that what they go through is immense pain.
But then again, it's I completely agree with you there. But you don't have to have experienced the pain or even experienced something to write about it, because I'm pretty sure Neil Gaiman didn't step through a door into another world and fight a spider monster, and he didn't meet an angel and a demon at the beginning of time and follow them through time.
Yeah.
So
I would say, though, it seems to me that from the standpoint of obviously both of us who write philosophy and who edit philosophy and publish philosophy, it is far more beneficial, typically speaking, just making a generalization, when someone does have experience with the subject that they're talking about on a personal level.
So, as we said with the earlier philosophers, they were built upon experience in that subject. So, the revolutions. Now, of course, if I tried to write revolution, given enough time and enough practice, I could do a pretty good job at writing about the Russian Revolution. But I will never do as well as Dostoevsky, because he was in the eye of the storm. He saw it firsthand and was taking notes as it happened.
Yeah, he saw what was coming.
Yeah, same as, let's say, you wouldn't be able to write about a quaint English town. You'd be able to research it, probably, you know, look at what it's like and say it, but the smells and the people you meet, well, I've experienced that. So I'd be able to put it
Exactly.
into slightly better words.
Yes, but that also that doesn't mean that someone who has a great imagination or is very good at doing vivid descriptions could not latch onto that. And
Oh,
I think that's
exactly.
the point. I think that's the point with Sartre is he internalized what Camus wrote as much as possible, but
Yes,
he simply couldn't write with the same fervor and passion.
yes. If without sounding too biased, because I have read a lot of Sartre's work with an unbiased mind, and I do think he, especially at some points, sounds a bit arrogant.
Well, it could be from what you say is a silver spoon.
Yeah, I at this point, well, to put it into perspective to the listeners out there, I started reading Sartre years before Camus. I didn't even know who Camus was until I saw a quote of his on Pinterest. And and even at points then I thought he's good but very arrogant at points. Kind of, he doesn't propose a third way to his philosophies or back them up. He kind of just wrote them, said, "This is it, take it or leave it."
And who is this, Sartre?
Start, yes.
Yeah, I think that Camus has much more flexibility and can be seen in different ways.
Exactly.
As someone who's read a lot more Camus than I have Sartre, it is much easier to put your own interpretations into Camus. And I think the
Right.
reason for that is because he wrote it from the artistic perspective in which we write a philosophical rambler rather than the academic perspective of,
Hmm.
I guess, to use a word, it would be stuffy.
Yes. Well, I will admit there are some Sartre that I have very much enjoyed, and that is Nausea, as well as some of his plays. Have you ever read any of his plays?
I have not, no.
I very recommend it. They are very short, probably if you performed them, they take an hour and a bit. So I very much recommend reading them because they are entertaining as well as informative. But when you say about you've read Camus, may I poke at that? Just ask what?
Off the top of my head, I'm trying to remember. He has so many different books,
Yes. Have you read his essays or his fiction?
his essays.
Ah. So
Yeah,
you haven't read.
I don't remember the exact books that I have read. Obviously, I'd have to go to my
Is it
shelf.
The Myth of Sisyphus?
I believe I've read that one, yes.
Yes, he wrote quite a few shorter essays for combat. Now, this is another thing. In During World War II, Sartre moved because he was basically scared of what was happening. He stayed the first few years in France and then moved.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Camus started publishing in an underground paper called Combat. Now, the Nazis who had occupied France at this point said this is a list of what is and is not allowed in publication, and anything that's published must at least be in the Nazi Party's, rules and regulations. And so Combat was easily, stricken off that list because it was promoting free speech, promoting ideologies and that the Nazis didn't agree with.
Yeah.
So, but Camus wrote for them in an underground the underground papers, publishing few essays about his absurdist beliefs of free thought. The world is meaningless. You're free to create your own, and of course, if you're the leader of a party that want, a I'm doing quotation marks, a pure race, and everyone to think and look the same. The notion of you're not meant to follow a leader is a bit out of their reach.
Exactly.
So, but I think the bravest thing was a lot of the people in the paper said written by anonymous. Camus actually put his name in. And
Yeah,
from then on,
yeah,
if the Nazis did pick up the paper, they'd just say, oh, look, Albert Camus lives at this address, right, go and find him. See what I mean? So
yeah.
while Sartre fled, Camus stayed. And I think, and continued to promote. And I think that separates the two drastically. A lot of people say them as the same, and on some very basic level of philosophy, they are. But also, they are completely different people.
Yes, but also I think what you're talking about, where Camus stayed, whereas Sartre fled, shows that Camus actually lived his philosophy, whereas Sartre wrote his philosophy, if that makes sense.
Yes, so I think we spoke about that in the last episode.
Yes, about how Nietzsche actually lived his philosophy
That
rather
was it.
than some of the others. But I think that what you're talking about with Camus, of like having his name backing up his work, I think that has a modern application
Even
today.
if it meant he'd have to die.
Yes, but I think that has a modern application today because we see a lot of debate on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, about people using anonymous accounts versus accounts with their name for their work.
Well,
Now,
this is...
yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry, finish off.
I think it is much more beneficial if you are writing general philosophy or something along the lines of Philosophical Rambler to have your name and to have your picture, or at least your name, with what you're writing. Because then it shows that you actually stand behind what you're writing and you're going to live with what you write.
Well, talking about stuff like that, very recently, and I'm talking very recently, about a few months ago, a guy called David Remnick. Now, he is the head reporter for the New Yorker, and I completely salute what he did, because he is very Jewish. You'd know he's Jewish just by looking at him, and he's got a very Jewish sounding name, and he is Jewish, yeah? So when all of this went out in Gaza, he said, send me out there to report on it. Now, it doesn't matter that he's a US citizen. They would have just shot him on sight for being Jewish. But he went out and spent a month in Gaza to report on it, even if it meant it killed him. Now, he's not a philosopher, he's a journalist, but I think that shows that you are sticking by your beliefs, which is what a lot of philosophers must do.
Yeah, and I think that has its roots, whether or not the person is Christian, the philosopher, I think that has roots in Christianity, just the societal environment that, even though Camus was obviously not a Christian.
What do you think of saints?
Yeah, I think of saints. I think of the martyrs for their work.
Yeah, what's her name? Joan of Arc.
Yes.
She died.
So I think of almost a martyr for their work. And I see Nietzsche in that way of he had looked so far into the abyss, obviously, that he was consumed. He went mentally insane, and then he died subsequently because of the mental insanity.
Yeah.
So he can be seen as having both started and completed his work. And I think the same is true of Camus.
Yeah.
Because he lived out his life. He started his work, like he wrote about his work based on what he lived. He lived it out properly after he had written about it and continued to promote it. And then he died without having recanted or having went back on what he had said.
Yes, well, do you know how he died?
Car crash, I believe, was it not?
Car crash into a tree, yes.
Yes. Which is the most absurdist way to die, it seems.
Yes, exactly. And as well, with the world having no meaning, it's quite ironic that he died with an unfinished novel.
Remind me, which novel was it?
That one was called The First Man.
Okay.
I've read it, it's very good, but it does just break off.
Yeah, it shows that even in his death of obviously having a car crash into a tree, that his last moments were absurd.
Oh, exactly.
It's a car crash into a tree is not something that happens every day. It's not very common at all,
Yes.
Um,
Well, there
and
is the
obviously it was
theory that the
unintentional.
KGB
What'd
cut
you
the
say?
brakes. There is a theory that the KGB cut his brakes.
Well, obviously we don't know if that's true or
We'll
not,
never
but
know. Yeah.
we'll never know. But I think it's a very valid point
He
about
did speak a lot about the Soviets and how, because he was, like most people in France, he was once a communist. And so, though at this point he hadn't finalized the philosophy of absurdism, he did once follow a kind of a higher being and structure of communism. But then when he learned about what they were doing in the camps, especially in Siberia, he left communism and spoke very outrageously against them, a lot like the Nazis. He went out there and gave speeches about what they're doing, spreading the word, and if the KGB did kill him, well, it doesn't matter because it's absurd. He carried on preaching that philosophy right to the very end, even if it meant it killed him.
yeah. I think that again that has its history or its roots
Yes.
in the societal part of the Christianity. Again, obviously Camus and Sartre were not Christians, but it shows the impacts of Christianity and the narratives that took place. Because obviously they would have been very aware of the saints and the martyrs and such.
Yes.
And so to live out your life in pursuit of an ideal, regardless of what ideal it is, and be willing to die for it, is a very honorable thing, in my opinion.
Yes.
And obviously, I'm not saying all ideas are worth dying for. That's obviously not the case. It's
No.
not worth the idea that vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream, for example.
Yeah.
But or even ideologies are not worth dying for in some cases. But what we see is a philosophy or the way that people view the world. If they have a positive view of the world, or if they have a critique of the world, and they're willing to sacrifice their entire existence for that, it shows that that idea has enough value, and it has
Yeah.
something. It has something backing it, and that backing is existence itself that someone's willing to sacrifice.
Now, going off from Camus and Sartre, because again, there are so many. We're going to have comments saying you miss this person or you miss that person, but we can't get to them all.
There's quite a few of them.
What are your thoughts on Simone de Beauvoir, the wife of Jean-Paul Sartre?
I am not intimately familiar with a lot of her work. I've only read quotations from her. I know
I've
that
read one of her works.
I know that she is more radical than Sartre, even from what I'm aware.
She was very much one of the first feminists.
That's what I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what did you think of her work when you read it?
Again, I've only read one of her works, but I've got a few on my shelf.
Okay.
And I thought she made her points very well, while keeping in mind that there are other people that she might need to convince, and not sounding too arrogant while writing them. But on the other hand, we have someone like Simone Weil. Do you know of Simone Weil?
I have heard of her.
Yeah. Well, she was one of the other French female philosophers who studied at the same school as Simone de Beauvoir. And she was another person that preached what they wrote. She wrote a few essays saying about her ideologies of we should teach our pupils kind of in a Plato way or an Aristotle way, and we should pass on the knowledge rather than just writing it down. So she only wrote a few essays, and then she became a teacher.
Which is the course for most philosophers, is they tend to either be a teacher, a lawyer, or something of the sort.
Yeah, whereas some philosophers take on like a professor job alongside their writing. Simone Weil wrote a few essays in her youth, I mean early 20s, and then stopped altogether and went into teaching. Not just teaching philosophy, but just teaching mathematics, linguistics, literature.
Yes.
and passing on the knowledge that she had learned onto the next generation, and that's what she believed in. So I think there's a pattern between good philosophers and bad philosophers. Well, there's no such thing as a bad philosopher, but a less good philosopher, and that is sticking to your guns.
Yeah, sticking to what you know. And I think that plays into what we were talking about earlier with Camus of actual experience.
Yeah.
Because if you look at different philosophers, Schopenhauer, for example, not to get off topic, but Schopenhauer, he didn't, for most of his life, he did not work because he was either at the university or he was enjoying himself in multiple various ways due
Yeah.
to the money that he received from his mother. So when you look at Schopenhauer and you look at his work and compare it to that of Nietzsche or of other philosophers, you can see how someone's upbringing and their environment affected their philosophy.
Oh yeah.
Schopenhauer is very decadent in his writing. He uses a lot of adjectives. He is much more focused from an aristocratic standpoint, almost, because he was, for lack of a better word, an aristocrat.
Yeah.
So, and then you look at Camus, and you see two different, almost competing ideologies. You see a class structure still taking place, even within philosophy, within a philosophical system that has nothing to do with class, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
Because Schopenhauer, I mean, he was able to do whatever he wanted, essentially, whereas Camus could not. So Schopenhauer has
So do you
critiques
think
of
that comes
society.
down to, again, your upbringing, whereas
Yeah.
Sartre had the money to move out, start a life, etc. at a very young age? People like Camus had to kind of really work for scholarships and probably weren't given the same opportunities.
Yeah, I think there's also a difference, though, between the physical barriers of, say, your environment and also psychological stress or psychological barriers, which is what you see with Nietzsche. Because
Yes.
Nietzsche had the psychological trauma and the psychological torment, but not necessarily the physical torment.
Yes. So
Because
what? Sorry.
Nietzsche was a professor, obviously, one of the youngest professors. So
Yes.
he was quite well off, relatively speaking.
Yeah. He had a good education, had the money to, burn basically.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
what do you think of? Now we've spoken about some of the most influential 20th century philosophers. Do you mind if I start to talk about the later philosophers, people like Slavoj Žižek and John Searle?
Sure.
Do you know much about this area of modern philosophy?
As you know me well enough, TJ, I tend to
Dabble
shy
in the
away from modern
classics, yeah.
philosophy.
Yeah. I'm more of a classical philosopher as well, but you do have to stick up with the times and look at what people are writing now. John Searle, or Dr. John Searle, is one of the few philosophers that is still alive. He's very old, but he is still here. And he approached philosophy from a scientific approach as well as a philosophical approach.
Mm-hmm.
So he mostly focused his life on consciousness. What is consciousness? So he wrote many essays about consciousness. And if you do Google books on consciousness, his name will come up, as well as David Chalmers. David Chalmers and John Searle, their names will pop up at least 10 times. So John Searle wrote these essays talking about what consciousness is, how we can define consciousness, and then wrote it in a scientific standpoint, saying, well, I've done tests, and when people think of love, the brain works at 40 hertz. When people are angry, it works at 60 hertz. So, do we need an electrical impulse to be conscious? And I think that's a very modern way of looking at it.
I think that's quite different from Camus or Sartre because
Yes.
they look at things from the emotional standpoint, or I guess, the psychological standpoint, but the interior. Whereas
Yes.
that looks at it more from the exterior of the
Yes.
scientific side of things.
But
It's
also,
really
the way
the
I
spirit of the
thought. Sorry.
age. No, I said it's really just the spirit of the age.
Yes. Well, that's what I was going to say. It was whereas what we were saying earlier, where it's the world is the one you're born in. If John Searle was born 100 years ago, you know, he would think about consciousness like people like Nietzsche. But in the modern age, now don't forget, I say he's very old, so he started writing about this stuff in the 70s. So it's semi-modern, you know.
Yeah.
But he started writing this in the 70s, but he now has the equipment, the scientific equipment, to test his philosophies. So it's kind of a half and half situation. He has an idea of a philosophy of consciousness, but we also have the machinery to test it.
I see.
And
So he was able to do more of an evidential-based philosophy.
kind of, he's still not like at a definitive equation that gives us consciousness, but his works have certainly given me a better understanding of how the brain works, what consciousness is, apart from like the unconscious brain and rage, and you know, what are we as a self. And he then proposed on what makes a computer conscious and whether they
What would
could
his
be
answer be to
conscious.
that?
Huh?
What would his answer be to the computer consciousness? I'm
Well,
curious.
he said that Alan Turing was wrong. Because in the modern day and age, we can't, you know, even with AI, there have been times where people have been on the phone and they think they're speaking to a normal human, but they're talking to an AI robot. It sounds that
Exactly.
good. Now, of course, according to the Turing test, that makes it intelligent and conscious. But we know that that little phone box that goes beep whenever it goes to voicemail, that's not conscious. It can't get up and build me a house or something. So
Yeah, it doesn't have rationalization.
it doesn't. It can only say what it's programmed to do. It can only say, "Hi, how can I take your call? We'll direct you." But it's just saying in a very real voice. So John Searle created the Chinese room theory, where imagine you are in a room, and outside the room is a Chinese speaker. Now, we do not speak Chinese, and he keeps slipping little pieces of paper written in Mandarin under the door. And inside your room, you have this giant book. And in that book is every response to every, you know, answer you might be given. And you scan the book, look at it, and say, and write the new answer and put it back through the door, and then he'll give you another one. You scan the book, write it out, give him the other one, and carry on with this. Now, the person outside thinks that they're speaking to another person who speaks Mandarin, but you're not. You're just copying. And he says that's all a computer can do. We might think we're speaking to another human, but we're not. Because that's all it can do. It can't speak to you directly. It can't go off its script. It could not speak to you in your language. It can't say everything. It can only do what it's told to do. And that's all it will ever be. So that I would consider him, especially if you look on his wiki, he's named as a scientist and philosopher. And have you ever read any of Zizek's work? It's intelligent and conscious, but John Searle said, well, that's not the case, because like the answering machine, nowadays it's so advanced, I might think it's another person, but it's an answering machine. It's not conscious. It can't build me a house. It can't go file all my taxes, and it doesn't know what to do. So you can't say, here's a choice, pick of them. It can only say those words it's programmed to do. "Hi, how are you? How can I redirect your call?" So on and so forth. It just says it in
Yeah.
a really real voice.
I think that's
So,
interesting though, because also the problem of AI in modern time.
exactly.
I mean,
So, sorry.
if you look at AI is not a human.
No, it's not. So, this answering machine that's become really modern and really real, Jean Paul's, not Jean, I keep saying his name, uh, John Searle would say, but that's not the case because this Chinese man outside thinks he's speaking to another Chinese man, but he's not. So, though we may have a general guess, it doesn't mean it's always right because in that room, I'm the answering machine. I can only say or write a process that is given to me. I cannot write in Mandarin myself, and that would make me conscious in that theory. So
It
I,
has a
I
failure that it requires you to write or speak in Mandarin, when
exactly.
obviously you're still a
So
human.
yes. So in hence it's a theory because you can interpret it as robots or humans or whatever. But this is where I like John Searle because if you look at his modern work, he is very scientific. But if you look at his earlier slash middle work, he is quite philosophical and scientific. And he's never chosen one over the other in favour. He's always been this mixed guy who backs up his conscious philosophies with science. Now, he's not reached a definitive answer like an equation of consciousness, but I can guarantee you if Sigmund Freud was alive today, well, don't forget, if Freud, what he did was he had a philosophy of consciousness. So he spoke to people about it, did therapeutic sessions with them to try and understand how the mind works. I can guarantee you if he was alive today, he would be just like John Searle, saying his philosophies and then trying to use science or psychology to back them up.
Yeah, I think that's a completely different approach than either the armchair philosophers or the existential philosophers who
Yeah.
focus on their experience. Because I would argue that they are more of a scientist rather than a philosopher. Of
Mm.
course, you can argue that they are a philosopher,
It's just that
but
Freud, well, back then, they didn't really have much in the way of science. So he was kind of stuck with what he was given, and that was the people. But if he was alive today and had all of this equipment, oh yes, he would have made so many breakthroughs.
I agree. But also, I think the difference between the scientist and the philosopher kind of blurs when it goes into that
Yeah,
realm.
it does.
But I think that it depends on what order you do things in. So if you come up with your theory and then you go out and you try to prove it, well, that's less scientific than you are, say, a scientist, and then you observe something happen, and then you make a theory based off of that.
Exactly.
So I
Yeah.
think if the first one is the philosopher scientist, whereas the second one is the scientist philosopher, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's the priority in which things take place.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, William James, the father of modern psychology, has a fantastic book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. That's one of the greatest books that I've ever read. And it really dives into the insights of, obviously, psychology, but also philosophy, theology, metaphysics, science, all the surrounding realms or areas, so to speak. And he is considered to be a psychologist. Yeah, I
Yeah.
would consider him to be a philosopher. So it also has some personal subjectivity as well.
Yeah. To what a person is.
Exactly. Because most people would say William James, well, he was the father of modern psychology. It's like, well, yes, that's true from an academic standpoint
But
and
you
probably
would say he's the father of psychological philosophy.
exactly. I would say he was a philosopher of metaphysics in a way. If you
Yeah.
just were to read that book of his and not know much else about him, which at the time when I read that book, it was one of the first philosophy
Mm.
books I read, funny enough. And it was mind blowing to me because I read it through the lens of metaphysics, not through a scientific lens or psychological lens, but
Yeah.
simply through personal experience and metaphysics. So you can read what you want into the philosophers as well, especially the modern ones.
Yeah, I completely understand.
So, is there anyone else for us to cover?
Think we've reached the end of that. Someone's going to comment that we've missed someone off, but I think for us, we've pointed on some of the main 20th century philosophers as well as the late 20th to early 21st. And
I
I think
agree.
that wraps it up pretty nicely.
Okay. Well, thank you to all of our listeners for listening to the second part of this series on the history of existentialism and specifically talking about both the early and contemporary existentialist philosophers. I'd like to remind you that we are a listener supported podcast. So if you feel so inclined, please check out our Patreon on our website so that you can continue to support our podcast. And we appreciate all of our listeners, and we look forward to seeing you next time.